I want to read a few words.
Boo, liar. Boo, Brian Griffin. Boo.
Anyway, I want to...
Boo, apologize somewhere else. Boo. Boo, Brian. Boo.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to apologize.
Why did you say ladies first? That's sexist.
It's just a standard greeting. Let me start over. Gentlemen and ladies...
Who says the man?
Okay, sorry. Humans in the audience.
I identify as a basketball.
Humans and basketballs.
I'm a parrot who mimics words but doesn't comprehend them.
Humans, basketballs, talking parrots, and whatever else is out there.
Whatever? It's whoever. Actually, it's whomever. No one likes you, Mary.
All right, just calm down, okay?
Now you're tone policing us.
That makes me uncomfortable. Anything that makes me uncomfortable in 2017 should be illegal.
You know what? I'm not a racist, all right? I just told a bad joke. There's a huge difference. But nobody on the internet ever takes the time to ask themselves, is this worth freaking out over? Or are there bigger problems in the world than this tweet? Well, I assure you there are. And just for the record, I love black people. I watch tons of black porn. So what do you all want from me? Huh? You want to ruin my life? Then congratulations, you did it. Everybody hates me. I can't leave the house without getting harassed. No one will hire me.
That was a problem before.
I can't turn on my phone without strangers telling me to kill myself or that they're going to kill my family. Leave me alone. I'm the self-righteous liberal douchebag, not you. I've kissed a transsexual before. How many of you can say that? Where's my medal? I am so far left, I'm spinning in circles, you. Instead of killing myself, I should kill all of you.
I'd like to see you try.
Ow! Jeez.
Come on, come on. Come on, come on. Come on, come on.
Quick point of privilege. Quick point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Guys, first of all, James Jackson, Sacramento, he, him. I just want to say, can we please keep the chatter to a minimum? I'm one of the people who's very, very prone to sensory overload. There's a lot of whispering and chatter going on. It's making it very difficult for me to focus. Please, can we just, I know we're all fresh and ready to go, but can we please just keep the chatter to a minimum? It's affecting my ability to focus. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, is there a speaker against name, chapter, pronoun?
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Please do not use gendered language to address everyone.
Okay.
Quick point of privilege once again. Quick point of privilege once again. Hi, James Jackson, Sacramento DSA, he, him. I have already asked people to be mindful of the chatter of their comrades who are sensitive to sensory overload, and that goes double for the heckling and the hissing. It is also triggering to my anxiety.
And now we're going to move on to the resolutions and
Very
amendments
brief.
committee.
Very brief point of information. If you are using a microphone, talk into it directly like I am right now, and do not wave your face back and forth because people cannot hear you. That is all.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the pointer.
I see that no one's clapping for me. It could be because I'm not engaging, but it also is because everyone's doing this. And that's really important because those loud bursts of noise, even though this is a noisy space, we can do something like reducing that. That's really important. So please don't clap, shoot up these. We have a lot of disabled comrades, and a lot of those are invisible disabilities. You don't know who it is that is having a more difficult time navigating this space, and this space was not created with all of their needs in mind. So it's up to us to modify that space to make sure that everybody is able to move in the ways that they need to move. And additionally, with the noise issue, like avoid hissing, avoid waving banners, right? Because there's all sorts of things. If you don't know what to do, show up these, right? I'm sure there's lots of ways that we can communicate to each other without needing to rely on something that's going to hurt somebody else. We have quiet rooms that are available. There's a range of options of these, right? Please don't go in that space with anything that's like an aggressive scent, for instance, right? Because we don't want to put people in stressful situations that they don't consent to, right? And there are right-wing infiltrators who are trying to get in here, but it's going to be really traumatic for people if we're not making an affirmative effort to de-escalate each other and de-escalate ourselves, right? Take a deep breath. Does that feel better? Before you say anything. Don't really talk to anybody who doesn't have a credential, especially if you claim to be from the press. You have no idea who that person is. Please do not talk to anybody who identifies themselves as a member of the press without having credentials. Don't talk to cops. Don't talk to MAGA assholes. We're almost there. Just but thank you. We are going to be visited tomorrow by some MAGA protesters. Is there anybody here who's done abortion clinic escort work? By all means, don't talk to cops if there are cops there for any reason at all, right? And if you do see someone talking to cops, let the marshals know. We are safe and we are strong because there's power in collective work.
All the counting has happened by a vote of 523 to 443. That passes. And so we will, sorry, if we could respect our comrades. Could you get to a mic, or could someone run a mic to you?
When we're raising our placards, when we transition between the votes, can we slow down a little bit? Because it's starting to get confusing for people. Thank
Totally.
you.
Yep.
Immediately, I mean, what it would have to be after the.
Sorry, that's a point of debate. That's not
Yeah.
actually.
Well, no, I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
No, that's out of order.
Doesn't
Sorry,
make any sense.
we've ended debate. Okay, so now we're going to vote.
I have a question, a point of order.
So voting yes would be to make it. Hold on, could I just get through my sentence, please?
Cities that are having a lot of violence. Ask him about is the feds getting involved in different cities that are having a lot of violence. Congressman Jerry Nadler, the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, was asked this weekend about who he thinks and characterizations of who's behind the protests. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
You disavow the violence from Antifa? That's happening in Portland right now? There's riots.
That's a myth that's being spread only in Washington, D.C.
About Antifa in Portland?
Yes.
What do you say, Congressman? He says, pinning this thing on Antifa is a myth.
It's scary that Jerry Nadler says that. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the committee that's supposed to look out for the rule of law, the committee that's supposed to be concerned about the Constitution and protecting basic rights and liberties, and Antifa, a terrorist organization, is anything but a myth. But remember, it was just 3.5 weeks ago when Mr. Nadler on the House floor in a debate with us said Antifa's imaginary. So at least he's consistent. He's consistently wrong about this terrorist organization that President Trump has rightly called a terrorist organization. Last weekend, officers blinded by these people using lasers. Officers attacked. So go tell the officers who've been blinded, the officers who've been attacked, if Antifa, ask them if Antifa's a myth or an imaginary organization. Ask Andy Ngo, the journalist who was attacked in Portland over a year ago, if they're an imaginary organization or some kind of myth. They are very real. They are very dangerous. Bill Barr knows it. That's one other reason why the Democrats are out to get Bill Barr, because he's calling it accurately and truthfully.
Okay, really quickly before you go, because we know there are efforts that you all are underway trying to hammer out another relief bill on coronavirus.
Yeah.
Democrats are saying it's unconscionable that addition to unemployment at $600 a week is being cut to $200, and also liability protections. They say this is all about protecting big corporations and not average Americans who need help.
No, liability protections are just common sense. That needs to be in any legislation that moves forward. And we obviously need to fix the unemployment situation. I've had countless number of employers in our district say that they can't get enough people to come back to work. The Great American Comeback is happening. The V-shaped recovery is happening. They can't get people to work because you're paying people more to stay home than to come to work. That's not a good thing. So let's take care of unemployment, but let's do it in a way that doesn't incentivize people to stay home and not come to work. That is just good common sense, something most Americans get, but unfortunately Democrats in Congress don't seem to understand it.
And they said they were anti-fascist. Really, it is very strange, because as I watched what it was they were doing, it was something that the Führer would have recognized as the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts in Nazi Germany that put Hitler into power. They were his thugs that roamed the streets and prevented political opponents from speaking, from appearing, in many cases beating them up. And they were behaving exactly like Antifa did today. And I said, they're not anti-fascist. They are the fascists, for Pete's sake. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Lefter here with you. Steve Schiller producing. Anthony Müller is a German professor of economics who's currently teaching college in Brazil. He wrote an essay called What Antifa and the Original Fascists Have in Common. Here's what he said. After the left has pocketed the concept of liberalism and turned the word into the opposite of its original meaning, the Antifa movement uses a false terminology to hide its true agenda. While calling themselves anti-fascist and declaring fascism the enemy, the Antifa itself is a foremost fascist movement. The members of Antifa are not opponents to fascism, but themselves its genuine representatives. Communism, socialism, and fascism are united by the common band of anti-capitalism and anti-liberalism. Antifa's ancestors, shall we call them, the origins, could be traced back to the Soviet Union about 1921 or 1922, in which the Comintern, meaning the Communist Internationale, developed a united front tactic to unify the masses through agitation and organization, and they were going to fight against capitalism and fascism, words which they used and are used today interchangeably. Then emerged out of that the Roter Front Kämpferbund, the Red Front Fighters League in Germany in July of 24. The group was ultimately banned because of its extreme violence. It had about 130,000 members who continued their activities underground in the Kampf, the struggle against Faschismus, of course represented by Hitler and his brown shirts. The movement spread elsewhere. In Spain, the Communist Party established the Milicias Antifascistas Obreras y Campesinas, which is the anti-fascist worker and peasant militias. And finally, the more modern Antifa movement derived its name from a group in Germany called Antifaschistische Aktion, meaning anti-fascist action, founded in May of 1932 by Stalinist leaders of the Communist Party in Germany. Obviously, it had to go underground when the Nazis finally succeeded in gaining power. Where it goes from there, well, we're going to take a look. Kyle Scheidler is Director and Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism at the Center for Security Policy. His principal focus is on domestic threats to security in the U.S. homeland. He's contributing author to Saudi Arabia and the Global Islamic Terrorist Network. Kyle, this whole movement that we call Antifa today, obviously interlocking with all sorts of other fellow travelers, where did it go from there and how did we get to today?
You correctly highlighted their origin story in the street fighting of the Weimar Republic in the 1920s and 30s. As you correctly noted, not much to distinguish them between the brown shirts. The tactics were mostly the same. Take over the street, beat your opponent, prevent him from holding meetings or rallies. That's step one. Step two, question mark. Step three, political victory. It worked for Hitler. It didn't work for the Stalinists in that particular case, and so they were suppressed. They do appear briefly after the war, mostly engaged in denazification of certain German labor unions, but after that there's not much use for them, and they sort of fade from history. The term reappears in the 1980s in use with the German squatters movement and an ideology known as autonomism. Autonomism is an anarcho-Marxist ideology. It is Marxist socialist, but also seeks the abolition of all authority in government. So it's anarchist in that sense. And these ideas were widely expounded by, for example, members of the urban communist guerrilla movements of the 1960s and 70s, mostly things like Red Army Faction and the Baader-Meinhof gang. So this was an ideology that did have communist terroristic roots and then adapted itself into the street movement of these young squatter punks in Germany. From there, it jumps the channel to England, once again under the name Anti-Fascist Action, and eventually comes to the United States in the early to mid-1980s. But they don't operate under the term anti-fascist at that point because most Americans don't know what a fascist is in the 1980s. They're not really focused on it, so they call it anti-racist action. And once again, its foot soldiers are made up of often young punks concerned with white nationalists, white supremacists in the punk rock music movement. So that's their focus. But we start seeing immediately upon their creation connections and consulting with America's historical urban communist guerrilla movements of the 1960s and 70s, with members, for example, the Weather Underground and Weather Underground splinter movement playing a role in helping to organize the then anti-racist action group. Eventually, in the mid-80s, early 90s, they changed from anti-racist action to anti-fascist action again, but the ideology essentially remains the same. That will pretty much take you up to today in terms of at least history and organization.
Germany's BFV, that's the equivalent of their domestic intelligence agency, they did a report on left-wing extremists, and they were talking about Antifa, and they said Antifa's fight against right-wing extremists is a smokescreen. The real goal remains the bourgeois democratic state, which in the reading of left-wing extremists accepts and promotes fascism as a possible form of rule and therefore does not fight it sufficiently. Ultimately, it's argued that fascism is rooted in the social and political structures of capitalism. Accordingly, left-wing extremists and their anti-fascist activities focus above all on the elimination of the capitalist system. That's the core to everything else. Everything else is just an excuse. You know, using that old dialectic that change agents like so much. You create the division, and then all of a sudden it gets hijacked. And we saw that with George Floyd. George Floyd was the trigger incident, but it moved real rapidly to other goals.
Right, of course. I mean, how do you move from an incident that I think really most Americans were convinced was an example of bad behavior or at a minimum criminal negligence by a police officer, and all of a sudden you move the conversation to abolishing the police and, by the way, the capitalist system. Of course, that's what Antifa exists to do, right? They exist to move and radicalize the conversation from issues we might all agree require reform, but they are explicitly anti-reform. They are revolutionaries by their very nature. And I think it's important to note also how they exploit racial division. This is very much a part of the ideology of the radical left from the period in which Antifa arose. I mean, if you read the manifesto of the Weather Underground, they very explicitly talk about America and its capitalist system as inherently white supremacist, inherently racist. And this is the ideology that Antifa continues to promote. And most unfortunately, it's an ideology that has been disturbingly mainstreamed by members of the left since the urban guerrillas of the 60s went mainstream and became professors and academics and politicians.
Hal Scheidler, Director and Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism at the Center for Security. So looking at the violence that we have seen here on our streets over the last couple of weeks, this is not my first rodeo. We saw the very same faces and their ideological heirs in the 1960s when the radical left stepped out and moved from class warfare to promote their Marxist ideas into racist warfare and did the very same thing they're doing today. Students for a Democratic Society, Weather Underground, Black Panthers, I could go on, faces like Angela Davis, black, Bill Ayers, white. Those two are still active today. They've been college professors. What was their promotion? Hardcore Marxism. Race was only the vehicle they were using to promote it, and they knew it and pretty much said so. It was this radical Marxist takeover of the civil rights movement that hijacked it for over 50 or 60 years. And remember, back in the 60s, they used to call the police pigs. They used to call the police helicopters whirly pigs. Did you ever read the Berkeley Barb? I did. I was there in the Bay Area when all of this was going down. This is not my first rodeo. Terry Tershi is former assistant director of the counterterrorism division of the FBI from 1994 to 1998. He directed the Unabomber Federal Task Force, his career at the FBI spanning 30 years, and in January of this year, co-authored a book entitled, in their own words, The Democratic Party's Push for a Communist America. More and more, the Democratic platform, it's radicalizing like Professor Kessler had predicted, looking much more like the Communist Manifesto.
When we look at the Weather Underground, I was back in New York, in the FBI, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, served in all those places and worked counterintelligence involving the former Soviet Union, and then moved to terrorism. And along the way, learned a great deal about all these groups and started getting into all the things they had written in the manifesto called Prairie Fire, which the Weather Underground wrote in 1974. And what prompted our book, in their own words, the Democratic Party's push towards a communist America. When you look at Prairie Fire, which is 180 pages, it was one of the last things the Weather Underground put out before they started running in a lot of directions because the FBI was shutting them down finally, is a strategy to essentially continue the revolution, to live to fight another day. And they said, we'll continue on for the next decade and we'll influence the educational system. We'll go where we can really hurt them in their own institution. And eventually from inside those institutions, we'll come back. And this is the strategy we'll use. And they laid that strategy out. Today, even though the Weather Underground had thousands of people out committing bombings and hundreds of thousands they could depend upon to come out and protest, provide them the cover they needed to make it look like their issues were the issues of the day that everybody supported, today there are smaller groups of people, but what has happened is the self-described Weather Underground communist-minded men and women have essentially transferred their ideology of communism into the Democratic Party. And the strategy that they set forth back in 1974 in Prairie Fire is the exact strategy that is being played out today. There's about 6 points that are critical to that and that we look at in this book.
Yeah, two things seem to happen with the group. You see that pattern, by the way, if you notice, Antifa is horizontally organized so that if one part of it gets chopped off, the rest of it keeps on going. The second thing that happens, if you notice, there's always a breakup in these groups. These groups fight with each other internally, and Marxist revolutions devour their own sooner or later. But go ahead, let's pick the 6 points. I want to hear them.
Sure, and before I do that even, I just would like to piggyback on something you just said about the breakups. The Weather Underground emerged from a breakup with the Students for a Democratic Society way back in the 70s. And they wanted to pursue the violent part of the revolution in the streets of America, where the SDS thought they were going to be more benefited by quietly and stealthily pursuing the political part. So today, if you draw a line from the SDS philosophical belief, you can draw it right into the Democratic Socialist of America. The Weather Underground, you can now draw into the rest of the Democratic Party. And these 6 points. The first one is capitalism. Capitalism to those folks was the enemy, and it had to be destroyed. So today, of course, when you hear AOC, who's a Democratic representative in our own United States Congress, say that capitalism is irredeemable and that capitalism doesn't work and we have to move away from capitalism, and you hear more and more Democrats saying similar things, then you know that the Democratic Party's platform and ideology now is lining up and is identical with exactly what the Weather Underground said. So capitalism is the first. They want to get rid of capitalism. They want to get rid of what provides people with the ability to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The second thing they want to do, they want to attack the Bill of Rights. The big thing with communism, of course, whether it's the Weather Underground or the Black Panther Party, they want to, in our culture, dethrone, I use the word dethrone God. God gets in the way of gov, right? It's not going to be in God we trust. It's going to be in gov we trust. And the bigger and more powerful the government is, the better for these people. And communism has no interest in having to compete with God. I think one of the things that really bothered me about the weekend and about the latest trend coming out of this is this whole thing of kneeling. People need to understand the symbolic nature of that and how that photograph is being taken out, how all these photographs of all these celebrities and sports stars and all these other people, that shot with Nancy Pelosi and her staff. The idea that you kneel, that's submission. And I was always taught, and I've actually heard it now in a couple forums where people are talking back, you're taught to kneel before God, not to kneel before government authority and not to kneel before somebody else who's telling you, kneel and do this before you can get up. Well, that's reminiscent of every major awful event of the past when the kings cut off somebody's head after they've knelt and given all their apologies in the hopes they can save their lives. But, of course, they're the first to get their head cut off. So that's a really bad trend, and I hope that somebody sees the light here. You cannot negotiate with terrorists, and you cannot submit to this kind of nonsense, because if we do this, and say we have what I think is a living nightmare, say Joe Biden gets in the White House, and say they sweep the House and the Senate, these same politicians now are going to be on the fast track to taking away the kinds of things the police need to quell these riots, taking away the ability of the police to act independently with the kinds of tactics that will work, and they will literally watch the next time our cities burn, and they will have no way to stop it, and this will get so out of control, and this whole thing will tumble into what a colleague of mine says, the abyss. Because as they attack the Bill of Rights, as they attack God, they're really attacking the rule of law, because our laws really come from the Judeo-Christian type philosophy, so that's so dangerous.
You know, Terry, two things in line with what you were just saying did come to mind this week. The first thing was the no-go zone that the protesters created in Seattle, covered about 6 city blocks, get rid of the police, and we're going to make this an ungovernable area, which, by the way, is the goal of change agents, community organizers, is to challenge the existing structure by destabilizing it. This just comes right out of the Alinsky playbook. But the second thing was, the same faces that are telling you we want to abolish the police are the very same political and activist faces that oppose people having weapons to defend themselves. So when we pitch over into the abyss, because we no longer have a police force to help us govern ourselves, what will then defend us? Or let's suppose they're right. All of the police agencies around the country are abusive. Well, how do we defend ourselves from that? See, this is all that clanging, banging, self-contradiction and internal opposition and everything they're spouting that we see because of this amalgam of Gramscian Marxism, Frankfurt School, postmodernism, and socialism. It's all wrapped in one big bailiwick, and it just goes from issue to issue, riding along on top of those issues, relying on the fact that there are true believers, meaning people who think that the issue is really all about police brutality or all about racism. It's not. And we know that going all the way back to the 1960s. We'll be back. We're at steelonsteel.com. I'm John Lefter. The program is Steel on Steel. What you're looking at today in the country is not just all of this neo-Marxist activity, this amalgam I talked about. You're also looking at 50 years of historic revisionism that has gone on inside of academia, to the point that today's millennials have a very distorted, lopsided view of what the country is all about. Many of them are getting depressed because they're being told that their parents are racist and they don't seem to be as concerned as the young people are. Those are the true believers that are marching down the street, and they think it's all about protesting racism. They have not a clue of what is going on underneath. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Lefner here with you. But also, as far as devouring your own, I didn't know if you noticed this, Mayor Lori Lightfoot of Chicago and Admiral Raymond Lopez, one of her harshest critics there, engaged in a very angry and foul-mouthed argument over the city's handling of its widespread violence during a conference call with 50 of the aldermen back at the end of May to discuss the city's response to shooting. The second time, remember I say they always devour their own? The other time is the civil war going on at the New York Times over which view is going to prevail, traditional liberalism or the new radical neo-Marxism. This is that internal nest sign fighting that goes on all the time in this type of a revolution, same as the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks or the Jacobins in the French Revolution. Terry Tershey's joining me right now. Did I say welcome back? Well, you're here. I'm here, so let's skip it. Former Deputy Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI from 1994 to 1998, co-author of, in their own words, the Democratic Party's push for a communist agenda. The same voices telling us we shouldn't allow citizens to be armed are the very same ones telling us that they want to abolish the police department. The only thing that's going to result from that is either dictatorship and an armed army or Gestapo that's going to contain the violence that erupts after that, or we're going to descend into vigilantism. You know, they're right out in the open about it now. You have to listen to the extreme things they are pushing for.
You're absolutely right, John. That's exactly where they want to go. It's actually there's an entire section of the 2016 Democratic Party platform. In this particular part, they talk about all of the police reform. Joe Biden has a huge section on his website, which is his plan to, quote, reform the police. And, of course, we laugh about his idea that part of the police reform is, shoot him in the leg. Well, there's a lot more that he doesn't know as well. And so his package gets very, very touchy and just really goes off the rails. So we'll go back then to the systemic racism part. The real philosophy behind that, the reason that they're so into this topic is that's their chief weapon. That was the chief weapon of the Weather Underground. And remember, 50 years ago, they were using that to try to overthrow the government then. And they left that as their main tactic in the Weather Underground's Prairie Fire. And now here we have it again, showing up, literally integrated into the Democratic Party's heart. The whole purpose of that is truly one thing, to sever the trust and the bond that local communities have with their police. And then to step in, we'll come to the rescue and we'll reform and we'll work with the police to change how they do things. Well, what they're really saying when you read all the fine line and the fine print, and I'm sure we'll see this in their police package they want to put before Congress here, what they really want to do is they want to take away the independence of the police. And they want politicians to control the decisions and the actions of the police. Well, politicians plus controlling the actions of the police equals authoritarianism. We know that. It equals a police state. And that's exactly where they're going. They want to intimidate and control the police. I'll deviate one little bit here. On the other side of town in Washington, D.C., what has been buried in the news, because they don't want to get into this since it's all unraveling for them, is that we've already seen how this works. Bob Mueller spent 12 years, a number of those as the FBI director under Barack Obama. And Bob Mueller replaced fidelity, bravery, and integrity with diversity, equality, and social justice. And we saw what happened to the FBI when it took on a couple of cases that should have been relatively simple. The Hillary Clinton email case, and then, of course, the Russian Trump invention, which they called an investigation. The FBI literally collapsed. It lied. It did a miserable job with those. Right now, many FBI agents who were in the FBI feel like I do. You can't trust it. And another FBI agent said this. He said, Terry, I have to tell you why I'm so worried. We knew the real FBI. We knew the FBI before Bob Mueller and before James Comey. And we both know, given what we learned in the field and learned in the street and learned about the enemies to America, that if the FBI collapses, America will not be far behind. And that should scare every single American citizen, because that's where we're headed. So I get back to the last three. I'll talk about international solidarity. International solidarity, you see all these demonstrations that look like they're spontaneous, that are springing up over the world in support of Black Lives Matter, in support of all of these issues. And in effect, they're not spontaneous. There is a constant, standing, organized effort to bring all kinds of groups to the table and to the street when something like this happens. And part of the key, the underlayment essentially of communism, is international solidarity. It is a globalist movement. It's not today connected, for example. People think of the former Soviet Union or Russia or whatever. This is not so much connected, although I'm sure they take advantage of it, to these other countries like Iran, China, and Russia. But it is independent movement based more on the idea of communism and socialism in their purity as ways to run countries. So this is extremely dangerous because people think, gee, all over the world, America is losing credibility. No, America is experiencing what communists are good at, which is organizing mobs of people. And that's all this is about. Two final things to the organization and management of these. The Weather Underground outlined the categories of people that had to be identified and then organized into masses to literally go to the street. And in the Prairie Fire Manifesto, they even say, we will own the urban centers of America. And like Che Guevara has told us, we will create not one Vietnam or two or three or four. We'll create many Vietnams in the cities of America, and the empire will finally crack. That is literally what they thought. So you look at the organization part, and of course, who did we have elected for years as president? We had the community organizer himself. And so this category of people in the Weather Underground Manifesto is described in many places. But essentially, it's back then in the 70s, it was Chicanos, blacks, Native Americans, women, and Asian Pacific Islander types. So it went like that. And then they had these phrases throughout the manifesto. You read the 2016 Democratic Party platform, they haven't even hardly changed the order. They've only changed a couple things, like we no longer use Chicanos, we use Hispanics, right? So all that's changed, but everything else remains the same. So we can really argue that the strategy that the Weather Underground thought would be successful as both a political and a revolution having both a political and violent side could be or was transferred into the heart of the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party platform. They called their 2016 platform the most progressive ever. It'll be fascinating when the 2021 comes out to see exactly what they have to say. But so this is why we wrote this book, and we go through it, and we then go the next route and compare the Democratic Party platform, Prairie Fire, the Communist Party of the USA website and platform, the Democratic Socialists of America. We get into a little bit about potential for funding, where this money is moving around. And then we get into a lot about linguistics and language and personalities, the actual representatives in the Democratic Party who clearly understand and adopted this and are probably some of the main figures in pulling this off. Because the real problem with today is that we now have just one American-type political party that's loyal to the Constitution and the oath of office. We have another one which reminds us constantly, we're about reconstruction, we're about reimagining, we're about the fundamental transformation of the United States of America. And that is absolutely frightening.
You know, you were talking about the FBI. I guess the reason I find this more troubling, there are two concerns, and we can probably unpack both of them here. Number one, the inability of the FBI seemingly to prevent certain forms of terrorism, and that would be the nexus between radical leftists, radical Islamist terrorists, anti-Israel groups, pro-Palestinian radical groups, this nexus that seems to exist with them, along with, I think there's something like 20 different Marxist organizations in the country. And the second one is the concern because of the abuse of the FBI. I mean, you had, like you said, people lying to the FISA court. But if they employ it, then they can begin using the force of law against people who are not politically correct, who are dissenting from this. And you and I both know there's enough laws around here to indict a ham sandwich if you had to.
Sure. Well, let's take that first. Let's take the rule of law aspect. The FBI knew how to work these two investigations that I mentioned before were relatively simple. The mid-year exam, which was the Clinton email, and then Crossfire Hurricane, which was the Russian Trump investigation. All through those investigations, and back in 2018, I mentioned this in an interview, I said, this doesn't look to me like the Russians have come across the door of the FBI. This looks to me like the Democratic Party has come in the door of the FBI. Something wrong here. Well, now what we know, and there is no question in my mind, and John, I worked counterintelligence for almost half my 30-year career. I worked counterterrorism for the other half. And I'll tell you that there is no doubt in my mind, there is no doubt in the minds of seasoned FBI agents who knew what they were doing, that this was a political party engaged in massive dirty tricks in both of these investigations and got by with it, essentially. So now we already had, before we went into the crisis we're in, we had this double standard. But the real problem with what the FBI was involved in is they were a partner, in my opinion, in trying to throw out, essentially, the President of the United States by making it look as if the man had serious connections with the Russians. Now, everybody really should have known from day one, since when has the Democratic Party seemed to care about national security and the Russians anyway? But that aside, they used all that they'd learned over many, many years of sometimes being in the White House, sometimes being in the majority. They know the road to follow. They know the playbook. So they understand in the intelligence community where they can go to turn all this information and all the things we've always known about the Russians into something that they could neutralize President Trump. And by golly, they have used that as the cornerstone of, quote, the resistance. And by the way, Weather Underground strategy, what they named it back in 1974 to overthrow the government, they called it the resistance. So this is not really very hard to follow these days. They're more and more out in the open. And the FBI became part of that. And we're all just kind of shaking our head. Now, what we already believed over the last 3 years is now really becoming filled in kind of by the facts. We can see as all these documents finally got out, mostly because of Mr. Grinnell, we can see that we weren't that far off. What is really frightening about it is that it's all pointing and marching right back to the White House, right back to the Oval Office in that January 5th meeting in 2017 involving Barack Obama and James Comey and their acting Attorney General at the time, Sally Yates. That is a fascinating glimpse at what was really going on. And I wish we had video of that. I wish we could have seen the batting eyes and the winks and nods, because that's exactly what happened. And then the next day, Comey goes up and dutifully briefs Trump on the things he can talk to him about, knowing that literally he's part and parcel of an effort that is going to try and get Trump out of office based around this Russian Trump thing. And our country has been disrupted ever since. It's amazing Donald Trump has been able to do as much as he has in office based on what he's had to face. It's just incredible to me that he can weather this and still be a fighter. And the problem for all of us is whether you like him or you don't like him, whether you like his gruffness or whatever, this is the guy that essentially, the way I look at it, was chosen to come along at this time. This is the personality we need to lead people against these others who are really trying to scare the daylights out of everyone. Now, the coup failed, right? So what do we have now? Well, now we got the violence in the streets. We've got the so-called peaceful protesters, and then we've got the actual rioters and the Antifa types and these other elements, BLM. Some are quiet, some aren't so quiet. But bottom line is, all of them are really unified by their belief in communism, by their belief in the ideology of socialism, which, by the way, never happened. There isn't any example of socialism that you can point to. Everything just basically collapses, and then along comes the authoritarian figure. That's what this is about, and it's not going to be any different here.
And, you're right about one thing. You can see this language just ported right over. The language is identical from the Maoist organizations to what's incorporated into the party. And it's also in danger of breaking up because there are dissenters walking away from the party at the same time. There's stress within it. And, of course, you know what happens then. Anybody who walks off the reservation gets attacked rather viciously, in the name of tolerance and diversity, by the way. Any closing thoughts, Terry? And where the book is, I'm assuming it's available at Amazon and Kindle and places like that.
Yes, the book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And I guess the closing thought, John, is just that there are so many people like yourself, shows out there, people trying to get the truth out. And I just hope people can get out and listen to those who are really trying to tell them and warn them that the lights are blinking, just like they were before 9/11. And we can see it all. It's very clear. And it's not just a matter of making an analysis or giving an opinion. We wrote this book so that people could make their own decisions after reading what these politicians are saying, have said, and then are doing. And it's essentially all in their own words. And it compares right up against the Weather Underground, the Communist Party of the United States, and generally the ideology of communism.
Any blogs or websites?
Yes. I'm on Twitter at Turchi. We have History Publishing Company's website, which is, I don't know it exactly, but History Publishing Company, LLC. They can go on and put that in Google, and they'll see the website. We also will be doing a lot more in the coming days on Instagram and Twitter as well. So there's quite a bit out there, and there'll be a lot more as the days go by.
All right, Terry Tershi, appreciate it once again. The book in their own.
It's going to be centered around on capitalism and its relationship to immigration. I, for the record, am not a conservative. I'm a revolutionary socialist, anarchist, communist, to be precise, which is much further left than Hillary Clinton. And if you ever want to debate with a real leftist, I'd be happy to debate anybody in Turning Point. You sit there and you call al-Baghdadi the greatest terrorist or the greatest genocidal maniac in the world, right? While ignoring the United States' historical role in the exploitation and the genocide of the indigenous peoples that lived here and the conditions that we consistently subject African American communities to, which I know what you're going to do. You're going to point it to Democrats. Yeah, the Democrats suck, by the way. I don't like the Democrats either. Like if Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton is about as far left as you go, you need to keep going. Don't go the other way. But my point being is, how can you ignore the contradictions within capitalism and its exploitation of indigenous peoples, and its exploitation of labor, and its exploitation of its ecological dislocations, while at the same time criticizing religious fundamentalists who should be criticized, while ignoring the genocidal behavior of the United States, the largest empire to ever exist? And those relationships can be proven through our historical... My name is Jorge, so that can be proven through our relationships with South America, via the way that we've developed South America through NAFTA and CAFTA.
I think I got where you're coming from. So there was a lot there. First of all, America's definitely made mistakes in our history. The Vietnam War was a mistake. The Iraq War was a mistake. But America is not a mistake. The world is a better place because of America. Allow me to finish. I allowed you to talk uninterrupted. South Korea exists because of America. America went to the Korean War for one reason only, to make sure that the Korean communists did not control the entire Korean peninsula. Tens of thousands of Americans died, so now that tens of millions South Koreans can live free. If we did not get involved in the Korean War, which people would say was empire building, but guess what? We gave the entire country back to the South Koreans, and they are a free, Western-centered, neoliberal democracy that is an amazing, beautiful country thanks to American interventionism. Now, mind you, America has made plenty of mistakes. I am not an apologist for every decision that America has made in the history of our country. However, America is a country that has made the world a better place. The world is more generous, more fair, more benevolent, more creative because of the American experiment and because of our country. When people are in trouble, America steps up. When there's a humanitarian crisis, America steps up. Most valuable countries, the largest cultural influence, and here's the final way that we can prove that America is indeed the greatest country ever to exist. There's two ways. Number one, we're the only country in the world where even those people who say they hate it refuse to leave. I'm waiting for all these celebrities to leave America, and I haven't seen it. Because there is no better country to be in than America. And number two, there is a waiting list, 45 million people long, to get into this country legally. We let in 1 million people legally into this country every single year. There's only 2 million legal immigrants into America every single year. We let in 1 million of those immigrants. In fact, I think that's too many. I think we need to actually have the RAISE Act by Senator Tom Cotton and moderately lower that over time. So this insinuation that America is an evil country and that it's within our fabric, which you're nodding your head and you agree with, is insulting to our history. It's an incorrect analysis of the good that we have done with the world. And honestly, it is not looking at what's actually happening to the amount of people that want to come into this country to make their lives better.
I wanted to talk about the mass gaslighting we've seen in the past 2 weeks. The left love to redefine words. Racist, fascist, bigot, sexist. These words have been misused and overused so much they have lost all meaning. Now the left are redefining what peaceful means. Any protest that has seen multiple murders, bashings, widespread looting and destruction of property is not peaceful. This is not peaceful. That was from California. This is from Antifa Central in Portland.
Police, stop! He's done. Leave him alone.
The full video shows the activist continuing to hector the man even as he lays bleeding on the road. So peaceful. Also in Portland, this man was bashed for standing peacefully with the American flag.
Because we're done with people like you.
Have your opinion.
This from Dallas was not peaceful. That man had made the stupid mistake of trying to defend shops armed with a sword. He was first pelted with rocks, and as you can see, he then charged at one of his attackers with the sword before the mob got him and bashed him unconscious, repeatedly stomping on his head and then robbing him. He was then attacked by the media for instigating the violence, for turning up with a sword. And this was Dave Dawn, a former St. Louis police captain who had served the community for 38 years. The 77-year-old grandfather was shot dead trying to defend a store from protesters and looters. These are just a few examples of the violence. These are not peaceful protests. You don't have more than a dozen people killed, many more bashed. You don't have businesses and homes burned to the ground in peaceful protests. Imagine for a second if Trump supporters were involved in mass protests that saw the sort of lawlessness we've seen in recent days. You think the media would be falling over themselves to portray the protests as mainly peaceful because the majority weren't involved in the violence? You think celebrities and the political class would be putting up bail money for those arrested? No, they'd be painted as violent extremists, and anyone associated with the protest would be similarly condemned. Now, celebrities are pushing for the police to be defunded. Yes, rich folk in gated communities with private security are calling for the defunding of the police. That will undoubtedly lead to bloodshed and mayhem in poor neighbourhoods. A report by Harvard University's Roland Fryer shows that when cops pull back, homicides increase dramatically in black neighbourhoods. But these protesters don't really care about all black lives. Certainly not the close to 90% of black homicide victims who are killed by other African Americans. Yesterday in Australia, we saw tens of thousands take to the streets in Black Lives Matter protests. Australians who have watched their livelihoods destroyed in the name of public health are entitled to ask why there's one rule for them and another for race-obsessed activists. You can't have more than 50 people at an outdoor funeral, but you can have 30,000 or more converging in the city. You can't have a beer at the pub without sitting down for a meal, handing over your phone number and socially distancing from other patrons. But you can gather in big crowds to hold up traffic and scream abuse at police. I wonder, do Australians marching under the banner of the Black Lives Matter movement really believe the group's claims that black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise? Australia devotes more than $30 billion a year on services for Indigenous Australians. There are a plethora of programs available exclusively to those who identify as Indigenous, from free dental care to a range of financial assistance packages to preferential treatment via admission schemes for schools and universities. All these programs are designed to help Indigenous Australians succeed. How can that be interpreted as systematic racism designed to destroy the black population? But we live in strange times where words are violence, silence is violence, but actual violence is not violence at all, but a righteous response to suffering and oppression. The Black Lives Matter movement that is being celebrated by the media, academia, and now the corporate world isn't about true equality. They push a toxic, divisive brand of race politics. Just read what their founders say. The mainstream in this country, the majority who have voted for the centre-right coalition 7 out of the 9 elections, better wake up and start realising that the culture wars are real. And while conservatives have been napping, the left has captured every public institution and now much of the corporate world, including the bulk of the media. Toxic identity politics and critical race theory is in the schools. And if there's no pushback, what may seem extreme today will be normalised tomorrow. Did you think 10 years ago that protests that have seen murders, bashings, looting, arson would be called peaceful? Did you think 10 years ago saying all lives matter would be so controversial that you could lose your job for posting it on social media? It's time to wake up and fight back against this crap, or take a knee and submit to it. There are only two options.
Look at a video from CBS in San Francisco called Berkeley Protest Victim. Women Punched on Video talks about assault during Berkeley demonstration. Let's check it out.
First off, let's talk about the day. Did you go up to Berkeley that day, or?
Yeah, we left early in the morning to drive up. It was like a 6-hour drive. So we left very early in the morning and got there around, I think, like 1 o'clock. But yeah, everything happened like immediately when we got there.
But like, why do you mention why you were going to Berkeley? Because you kind of said you wanted to collect 100 Nazi scalps.
But yeah, everything happened like immediately when we got there.
That you want him to do you so much you could do anything.
Come on, Antifa girl. Let's be real here. You came to Berkeley to fight, you fucking airhead. Not only did you tweet that and post it on your Facebook, but you also showed up with weighted fighting gloves on, which are illegal, by the way, and you were also caught holding and throwing glass bottles as weapons. You weren't attacked, Moldylocks. You showed up to an opposing group's demonstration to start fights. You were the aggressors. You started a fight and simply received a punch back. For those who don't know, this is Antifa girl. Antifa is short for anti-fascist, which is ironic because their group uses textbook fascist tactics. They use violence to silence those who don't adhere to their ideology. Doesn't get more fascist than that. In reality, Antifa is a group of far-left, upper-class white communists who like to roleplay on the weekends as revolutionaries fighting against oppression by using their own oppression, no less. Since last year's election, they've enjoyed some moderate success in disrupting conservative events like this one by using their violence. At recent events, though, just like everybody knew would happen, the right has gotten hip to the Antifa shtick, and now there are larger groups of conservatives at these events prepared to throw down. And guess what? Skinny, young, sheltered white kids like the ones in Antifa, well, they don't know how to fight. They've never even been exposed to actual, legit, real-world violence. As opposed to the blue-collar working men on the conservative side, who have seen a scrap or two and don't get queasy at the sight of blood. It looks like the chickens have finally come to roost for Antifa, and it's been a great ride for all of us to watch. Now back to the video.
Now, are you part of any groups that were up there, or were you just going on your own?
We kind of went up as a collective. I'm with the Oak Roots Collective, which is like a coalition of different groups in Ventura County and the Valley. And we kind of went just as individuals. We weren't going of like, oh, Oak Roots, but we just kind of went up to show our support and just be bodies present as counter-protest.
So in order to milk this victim card as much as possible, Judge Dreadlocks here has to back away from any association with Antifa. That's why she uses that vague collective word all the time, so we don't really know who she's talking about, what group she's talking about. And the reporting here is another big issue. All the big news outlets like CBS are going along with this shit. They don't question her about her Nazi scalps post. They don't comment on the fact that she helped start a riot to try and shut down a free speech rally. The reporter never mentions that this girl and her cronies threw fireworks and small explosives